America owes an amount of money so large that most people can't even picture it. Not millions, not billions, trillions. Today, U.S. government debt isn't just high. It's reached a point where repayment is no longer a political question. It's a mathematical one. And that's the part almost no one talks about. Because when a problem becomes mathematically unsolvable, governments don't debate solutions. They change the rules of the game. The interest on America's debt alone is now approaching $1 trillion a year. That's more than many entire federal programs. More than what the country spends on things most people assume are untouchable. And every year that interest grows faster than the economy meant to support it. At this scale, debt stops behaving like normal debt. It begins to behave like gravity, pulling resources inward, distorting incentives, bending policy around itself. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The United States is no longer in a position to pay back its debt in any traditional sense. Not through higher taxes. Not through spending cuts. Not through a miracle surge in economic growth. Those options look reasonable on paper, until you run the numbers. And when you do, something unsettling becomes clear. The real plan is already in motion. It doesn't involve default. It doesn't require an announcement. And it doesn't look like a crisis, at least not at first. Instead, it works quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. Over time, trillions of dollars in debt don't get paid down. They fade away. Not because the government writes them off, but because the value of the currency used to repay them slowly erodes. This is the story of how unpayable debts are erased without ever being called defaults. How governments transfer the cost to savers, investors, and anyone holding cash, without passing a single new tax law. It has happened before. More than once. Using the same playbook. And if you know what to look for, you can see it happening again, right now, stage by stage. Most people won't notice until years later when their savings buy less, their returns fall behind prices, and they wonder how it happened. By then, the transfer is already complete. This is Finance Archives. And today we're breaking down why America isn't paying its debt. It's making it disappear. Let's remove politics for a moment and talk only about math. Because the math is brutal. At today's levels, U.S. government debt isn't just large, it's self-reinforcing. The more debt exists, the more interest must be paid. The more interest is paid, the more borrowing is required. And the cycle feeds on itself. Interest is no longer a side expense. It's becoming one of the government's largest obligations. And here's where the illusion breaks. People often say, why not just raise taxes? Why not cut spending? Why not grow the economy faster? Each of those sounds reasonable, until you scale them to reality. Start with taxes. To meaningfully reduce the deficit through taxation alone would require something politically unthinkable. Across-the-board increases so large they would slow the economy immediately. Not targeted taxes. Not closing loopholes. Not symbolic hikes. We're talking about structural increases that would drain demand, suppress investment, and likely trigger recession, shrinking the tax base just as rates rise. That's why no serious government proposal relies on taxes alone. Not because politicians lack courage, but because the math doesn't close. What about spending cuts? Here's the problem almost no one explains clearly. Roughly 2/3 of the federal budget is mandatory. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt itself. These aren't discretionary items. They aren't voted on every year. They grow automatically, driven by demographics and prior promises. Cutting them means rewriting the social contract. And politically that's radioactive. That leaves the remaining third of the budget: defense, infrastructure, education, research, public services. You could slash every discretionary program to the bone. You could freeze hiring, cancel projects, hollow out agencies. And even then, you still wouldn't balance the books. So what about growth? The optimistic scenario. If the economy grows faster than debt, the burden shrinks over time, at least in theory. But at high debt levels, growth stops being a solution and starts becoming a victim. Capital that might fund private investment gets absorbed by government borrowing. Interest rates face upward pressure. Productivity gains weaken. History shows that once debt passes a certain threshold, it constrains growth rather than accelerating it. And today the U.S. is already well past that threshold. This is the trap. The tools that work at moderate debt levels stop working at extreme ones. Taxes choke growth. Cuts trigger backlash and recession. Growth can't outrun compounding interest, which means something fundamental has changed. The debt isn't going to be solved. It's going to be managed. And when debts become unmanageable, governments don't eliminate them directly. They reduce them indirectly. by changing what repayment actually means. In the next section, we'll look at how the US got here, and how years of cheap money quietly set the stage for the only option left. To understand why the debt became unpayable, you have to rewind the story. Not decades back, just far enough to when borrowing stopped feeling expensive. After the 2008 financial crisis, something unprecedented happened. Interest rates collapsed. Central banks pushed them to zero, and in some places below zero. Money became cheap. Then it became free. Governments discovered a dangerous truth. You could borrow enormous amounts of money, and no one would punish you for it. The cost of servicing debt barely moved. Deficits stopped looking scary. Hard choices were postponed year after year. Why raise taxes when borrowing costs nothing? Why cut spending when markets are willing to lend endlessly? Debt stopped feeling like debt. Then came the pandemic. An economic shutdown on a scale modern systems had never experienced. Governments responded the only way they knew how. They spent. Trillions were deployed almost overnight. Stimulus checks, business support, emergency programs, backstops for entire markets. Necessary? Arguably. But here's the critical part. Almost none of it came with a long-term repayment plan. It didn't need one, because rates were still near zero. Debt issued during that period carried historically low interest. Bonds yielding 1, 2, sometimes less than 1%. For a while the illusion held. Inflation stayed quiet. Supply chains masked price pressure. Officials called it transitory. But debt doesn't disappear just because it's cheap. It matures. And when it does, it has to be refinanced. That's when the environment changed. Inflation surged. Central banks were forced to raise rates, fast. Suddenly, debt issued at near-zero rates had to be rolled over at 3, 4, even 5 times the original cost. A bond that paid almost nothing in 2020 came due in a world where money was expensive again. The interest burden exploded. Not because new spending went out of control, but because old promises became vastly more expensive to maintain. This is where the system cracked. Raising rates further might control inflation, but it would also push government interest costs into dangerous territory. Keeping rates low would protect debt service, but allow inflation to eat away at purchasing power. There was no clean exit. The era of cheap money didn't just enable borrowing, it locked it in. And once the debt reached this size, the rules changed. At that point, governments don't ask, how do we pay this back? They ask a different question. How do we make this burden smaller, without calling it a default? That answer has existed for centuries, and it always begins with the same mechanism. In the next part, we'll break it down, step by step, and explain how debt can vanish without ever being forgiven. When governments reach a point where debt cannot be repaid honestly, they don't announce failure. They redefine success. There is a crucial distinction almost no one outside finance pays attention to. Nominal value versus real value. Government debt is issued in nominal terms. If a bond promises to pay you $100,000 in 10 years, the government's obligation is simple. Deliver $100,000. Not a promise of purchasing power. Not a promise of stability. Just the number. Now ask the uncomfortable question. What happens if those dollars buy far less by the time you receive them? The government still pays. The contract is fulfilled. There is no default. But the real burden of the debt has quietly shrunk. This is not theory. It's arithmetic. If inflation runs higher than the interest paid on government debt, the debt erodes in real terms. Slowly. Predictably. Relentlessly. And the losses don't disappear. They are transferred. From savers. From bondholders. From pension funds and insurance companies. From anyone holding cash or fixed-rate assets. This process has a name. Financial repression. It doesn't look like a tax. There's no legislation. No vote. No announcement. Instead, it works through price levels and interest rates. If inflation runs at 6% but your bond yields 4%, you are losing 2% every year, guaranteed. You are being taxed invisibly. And unlike income taxes, you can't opt out. This is why inflation is such an effective tool for governments under debt pressure. Defaults are loud. They shatter trust. They create legal and political chaos. Inflation is quiet. People blame corporations, supply chains, greed, global events. Very few connect rising prices to deliberate debt management. Yet from the government's perspective, the outcome is ideal. Debt obligations stay fixed in nominal dollars. The economy grows in inflated terms. And over time, the debt-to-GDP ratio falls. No crisis headline required. This strategy is so reliable that governments return to it again and again, whenever debt reaches levels that can't be confronted directly. And there is one historical example that matters more than all others. Because it didn't happen in a fragile economy. It didn't happen in a failed state. It happened in the United States, right after the most expensive war in human history. In the next section we'll look at what America did after World War II, and why that period quietly explains far more about today than most people realize. In 1945, the United States faced a problem that should sound familiar. The war was over. Victory was secured. But the balance sheet was wrecked. Government debt had exploded to levels never seen before. Measured against the size of the economy, it was higher than almost anything America had experienced, before or since. The country had borrowed massively to win the war. From citizens. From banks. From institutions. The question was simple, and terrifying. How do you pay it back? Raising taxes wasn't realistic. The population had just endured the Great Depression and a global war. There was no appetite for austerity. Cutting spending wasn't an option either. The country needed to rebuild, reintegrate millions of soldiers, and transition to a peacetime economy. So policymakers chose a different path. They didn't call it a strategy. They didn't announce it publicly. But they executed it with precision. First, interest rates were kept artificially low. Government bond yields were capped well below what a free market would demand. Whenever yields tried to rise, the central bank stepped in and bought bonds, pushing prices up and rates down. At the same time, inflation was allowed to run hot. Price controls that had existed during the war were lifted. Pent-up demand exploded into the economy. Inflation surged well above the interest paid on government debt. This combination is critical. Low nominal rates. High inflation. The result? Negative real returns. Every year, bondholders received their interest payments. And every year those payments bought less. No contracts were broken. No defaults declared. But in real terms the debt was shrinking. Quietly. Within just a few years the debt-to-GDP ratio fell sharply. Not because the government paid off massive amounts of principal. But because inflation and growth did the work for them. And this wasn't a short-term trick. For decades after the war, real returns on government bonds hovered around zero, or below it. Anyone holding them lost purchasing power over time. But there was nowhere else to go. Capital controls limited foreign investment. Corporate bonds carried default risk. Stocks were volatile and culturally distrusted. Treasuries were the only game in town. The system worked because it forced participation. This is the essence of financial repression. And it worked spectacularly. Over a generation, America reduced an enormous wartime debt without austerity, without default, and without public backlash. On paper it looked like responsible governance. In reality, it was a slow, deliberate transfer of wealth from creditors to the state. That historical success is why this playbook still matters. Because when governments face impossible debts, they don't innovate. They repeat what worked. The question now isn't whether this strategy exists. It's whether it can work again. In a world that looks nothing like 1945. In the next section we'll bring the story forward. And look at how this same mechanism has already been quietly deployed in the modern era. You don't have to go back 70 years to see this strategy in action. You only have to go back a few. During the pandemic, governments did something that would have been unthinkable in any other context. They borrowed without restraint. Trillions in new debt were issued in a matter of months. At the same time, central banks stepped in as the dominant buyers. Rates were pushed to the floor. Bond markets were stabilized. Money was created on a scale never seen in peacetime. Officially, this wasn't debt monetization. Technically, bonds were bought on secondary markets. Functionally, the result was the same. The government spent. The central bank absorbed the debt. And the system was flooded with liquidity. At first, inflation stayed quiet. Supply chains were frozen. Demand was suppressed. Officials reassured everyone that price increases were temporary. Then the pressure broke. Prices surged across energy, food, housing, and services. Inflation reached levels not seen in decades. And here's the critical detail most people missed. While inflation was running hot, the majority of government debt was still locked in at extremely low interest rates. Bonds paying 1 or 2% were outstanding in an environment where inflation was far higher. That gap mattered. It meant that in real terms, debt was shrinking rapidly. Bondholders were losing purchasing power every year, sometimes dramatically, while the government's obligations stayed fixed in nominal dollars. This wasn't a side effect. It was the mechanism working. Eventually, central banks raised rates to contain inflation. But notice how careful the response was. Rates rose, but not enough to fully offset inflation for long. And once the pressure eased slightly, policymakers hesitated. Why? Because higher rates don't just cool the economy. They raise government borrowing costs. Every additional percentage point means hundreds of billions more in annual interest. There is a limit to how restrictive policy can become before the fiscal math breaks down. So central banks are trapped. Raise rates too aggressively and debt service explodes. Hold rates too low and inflation erodes purchasing power. The result is a narrow corridor. Inflation slightly above interest rates. Just enough to claim progress. Not enough to collapse the system. This is modern financial repression. Not through explicit yield caps or formal agreements, but through coordination, signaling, and constraint. The system doesn't need to say it out loud. Markets understand. And so do large investors. They price in the reality that inflation will be tolerated, to a point, because the alternative is fiscal crisis. This is why long-term yields behave the way they do. Why real returns remain compressed. Why cash quietly loses value year after year. The erosion isn't dramatic enough to cause panic, but it's steady enough to matter. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. Because when this process unfolds slowly, most people don't recognize it as policy. They experience it as frustration, as falling purchasing power, as a sense that saving no longer works the way it used to. In the final section, we'll zoom out. We'll connect the dots, and we'll explain what this all really means. Not for governments or markets, but for everyone living through the largest quiet wealth transfer of the modern era. Here's the part almost no one tells you directly. This isn't a future plan. It isn't a theory. It isn't something that might happen. It's already happening. Every year inflation runs higher than the interest on your savings. Every year bonds deliver nominal returns that quietly lose real value. Every year the purchasing power of cash slips, slowly enough to feel normal, fast enough to matter. This is how the debt disappears. Not through repayment. Not through sacrifice at the ballot box, but through dilution. From the government's perspective, this is the least painful option. No default headlines. No emergency votes. No sudden collapse. Just time. Time transfers wealth from creditors to debtors. From savers to borrowers. From anyone holding dollars to the issuer of those dollars. Most people don't see it as policy. They see it as life getting more expensive. Higher rent. Higher food prices. Savings that don't stretch as far as they used to. They blame corporations, supply chains, greed. Rarely do they connect it to the balance sheet of the state. And that's why this mechanism works. Because it doesn't feel like a tax, even though it functions exactly like one. A tax on cash. A tax on fixed income. A tax on anyone who believes stability means safety. History suggests this strategy can succeed. Debt burdens can shrink over decades. Balance sheets can normalize. Crises can be postponed, sometimes indefinitely. But success depends on conditions that are far less forgiving today. An aging population. Rising entitlement costs. Foreign creditors with alternatives. Markets that understand the playbook. The margin for error is thin. If inflation runs too hot, trust breaks. If rates rise too far, debt service explodes. If confidence slips, the quiet erosion becomes visible, and then political. That's the risk. Controlled erosion works. Until it doesn't. What's certain is this. The transfer is already underway. You're not watching history being planned. You're watching it execute in real time. And understanding that changes how you see everything. Money. Savings. Risk. And the promises governments make when the math no longer works. If you want more breakdowns like this, if you want history, finance, and power explained without noise or illusion, this is exactly what we do here. Subscribe to Finance Archives. Because the most important financial events rarely announce themselves. They unfold quietly, while everyone is looking somewhere else. And we're here to archive them.